All right, welcome everyone. It is Sunday night, September 1st, right? Yeah? All right. September 1st, 2024. I'm Glenn Rawson, and right now I am coming to you from the basement of the Radisson Blue Hotel in Edinburgh, Scotland, and I have a live audience. And I'm honored that you would take the time to come and be here because usually when I'm doing these devotionals, I don't get to have a live audience. And I know for a fact, if I have warm bodies in front of me, I'm much more alive than when I'm talking to a green dot. And I know beyond that green dot, you're there and there's thousands of you there, but it's still hard to look you in the eye through a green dot. All right, so by the way, I just wanted to make mention of the fact that this is for you and you here, that starting the end of September, 30 days from now, I'm going to be taking with Dennis Lyman a group of people out to Martin's Cove for a 3-day tour. And all that is we drive at a coach out of Salt Lake, luxury coach out of Salt Lake. We go out to Casper, we see the temple, and then we work our way back into Salt Lake over 2 more days, touring the Pioneer Trail. It's only 3 days, 2 nights, 3 days, and that one will be, there'll be one on September 30th, and then there'll be another one on the 24th of October, which if you know Wyoming, that's really dumb. Because what happens in Wyoming in October? It snows, and it might, but that's the whole point. We're going out on the 24th of October, and I'll be teaching the winter rescue of the Willie and Martin Handcart Company. It is intense and very emotional. So those 2 tours will be happening September and into October. And if you're interested in those, go to historyofthesaints.org or go to glennrawsonstories.com. There's still some seats available for those. And then I'm going, I don't know when, Josh, but I'm going with Fun for Less on the Panama Canal trip. But I think it's sold out, isn't it? It is. Okay. All right. Well, never mind. But the other trip that's available with Fun for Less tours, if you haven't done this, and you like LDS history, come with me next year. I think it's May. I'm going to be taking a group, and I'm going to be going from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, all the way to Carthage, Illinois, teaching the early foundations of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I would love to have you come, especially you guys. I know you. It would be fun to have you. And that too is a very intense trip, a lot of church history. Teddy, you were on it?
That's why I'm back with you.
Oh, that's why you're back now. Okay.
That's why.
Anybody else done that trip with me? Okay. Yeah, a couple of you have. It's a very intense trip, and I would love to have you come. All right. So now with those preliminaries, I ask you here and there to have a prayer in your heart. I have seen miracles happen through these stories. They're not my stories. These are true stories from the pioneers or the individuals I'm talking about. They're not my stories. They're their stories. And I'm just the guy that gets to tell them. First story. James Montgomery was born November 1st, 1771 in Irvine, Scotland, not that far from where we are. He was raised the son of a minister. At the age of 6, James was sent to school near Leeds, England. His 2 brothers followed him a couple of years later. Then in 1783, so he would be 12 years of age approximately, his parents came to his school and they spent 3 months together just before his parents left for the West Indies as missionaries for the Church of England. James would never see his parents again. They went to the West Indies, and they died in the mission field. Later, James would say of his parents, they dug with deep furrows with the gospel plow and then fell down dead in those furrows through excessive labor. They worked themselves to death in the ministry of Christ for their church. Well, while a student at school in Leeds, he came to love poetry. But unfortunately, poetry in the school where James was raised was forbidden. It was a waste of his time. So he, quote, frequently found means to borrow books and read books by stealth. It became a passion with him to write poetry, albeit one that took him away from his prescribed studies. By the age of 13, James had filled up his first volume of poetry, and evidently it was good. He excelled as a poet and as a writer, but not as a student, if you can believe that. Consequently, they released him from school and said, well, if you can't be a good student, we'll make a good clerk out of you. So they put him to work clerking in a store. He hated it. By the age of 16, James was ready to break loose and go see the world. He found employment of his own choosing. Now, he's still a teenager, and then devoted his free time to the reading and writing, composing of poetry. In April of 1792, James picked up a newspaper which was running an ad for a clerk to work at the Sheffield Register. That's a newspaper in England. James answered the ad. And at that time, politics was a very divisive issue. Sound familiar? Yeah, I get emails every day on that stuff. And James found himself drawn into the fight, into the politics. He said, I entered in the feelings of those who avowed themselves the friends of freedom, justice, and humanity. In other words, I wanted to work for the good of all mankind and the freedom of all mankind. Well, the editor of the paper, his name was Gale, became a little bit too inflamed in his political editorials and became targeted to go to prison. The man managed to get out of town and was forced to flee. Where? To the colonies. He came to America. So James took over the editorship of the local newspaper and renamed the paper the Sheffield Iris. Sounds very girly. But that was the whole point. He was going to get out of the realm of politics, and he was going to talk things that were edifying and peaceful. He published the paper's new motto, which was, quote, ours are the plans of fair, delightful peace, unwarped by party rage, to live like brothers. Peace. Let's stop fighting and just get along. But peace was not to be, because James was within 2 months served with a warrant, arrested on charges of sedition, and sentenced to 3 months in the tower at York, where you'll be tomorrow. You'll see that tower at York. Well, how come? Because his paper had done a favor for a local in publishing an editorial, and the editorial was read by the king's people and said, that's sedition. But instead of going after him, they went after James and stuck James in prison. Well, once he got out, he once again got crossways somehow with the king. There's no freedom of speech. And once again, he was sentenced to 6 months in jail there in York. He bore his punishment with meekness, and while his health declined, his conscience remained bright. He went back to work to his editorial duties and continued to write, quote, and give unstintingly of his literary talent for the support of worthwhile religious and humanitarian causes. He became recognized in the years that followed as a friend of the people, a champion of the cause of liberty and freedom. He interceded on behalf of slaves, chimney sweeps, widows, and the destitute. He was the friend of all mankind. To the end of his days, James served, loved, deeds of philanthropy, worthy causes, the composing of hymns, the publishing of poems. He was just a good man, but not a good man in a closet. He was a good man that did good. Well, in 1849, the now celebrated poet and composer became seriously ill. And while listening to some of his own hymns that he had compiled, he commented, quote, "As all my hymns embody some portion of the history of the joys, the sorrows, the hopes, and the fears of this poor heart, so I cannot doubt, but they will be found an accurate vehicle of expression for the experience of many of my fellow creatures who may be similarly exercised during the pilgrimage of a Christian life." In other words, I have written poetry that should sing in other people's hearts and give expression to what they've been through. On Sunday, April 30th, this good man who loved the strangers passed away quietly in his sleep. And there in the town, the forges and workshops of smoky Sheffield were deserted. The town went dark. Thousands of mourners swelled the funeral train, which took an hour to pass any given point in the community. So many people wanted to follow. Quote, "The common man had lost an uncommon friend." James Montgomery, patriot, poet, Christian disciple, friend of God and man, wasted and wore out his life in the service of others. He spoke with hope that his words would give expression to others who similarly were service-oriented Christians. These hopes would be fulfilled for James Montgomery in a way he could not even have imagined. One of his words, his poems, you may not recognize his name, James Montgomery, but you will recognize words that he wrote in 1826 that expressed his own experience. Quote, "A poor wayfaring man of grief hath often crossed me on my way, who sued so humbly for relief that I could never answer nay. I had not power to ask his name, whereto he went or whence he came. Yet there was something in his eye that won my love, I knew not why." A poor wayfaring man of grief. How similar is the life of James Montgomery and another man who similarly wasted and wore out his life in dedication to the Master and the service of all men, the prophet Joseph Smith. Carthage Jail, June 27th, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 1844. That poem that was written by James would later be set to music by George Coles and retitled today, A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief. But you are standing, as it were, on the origins of James Montgomery. And tomorrow you'll see where he wrote it. Second story. Now, I'm going to talk to these folks for a minute because you're not here and you didn't have the experience, but you will next time. Today, I was with, I forgot her name, not Christine, the other lady. Davina, that's right. We had a guide today, Davina, and she took us up through Edinburgh Castle. And those of you that were with Davina, and I don't know, how many of you went through the state apartments? You went through the state apartments. Right next door, those of you that were with Davina's group, I said, you see that mark over the door, 1566? You got to go through those apartments. How many took the assignment serious? Well, that went well. 3 of you? Okay, a couple more of you did. It was late in the evening of March 26th, 1603, when King James VI of Scotland, who was born right there. He was born right there in those apartments. I wasn't wasting your time. Okay? Received word that his cousin, Elizabeth I of England had died and named him as the rightful heir over the throne of England. So he set out from Edinburgh, traveling south to London. It would take him 6 weeks. And along the way, he was beset with people who came with special interests and wanted the king's attention. Please fix this and please fix that. Do this, do that, etc. Well, James was to inherit the throne of a kingdom ripped apart with religious tension. Catholics and Protestants were fighting with each other, and both of them thought James was the solution to their problem, and they all wanted him to listen to them. But as it turns out, the Catholics didn't fare well. James was a Protestant, but his mother, Mary, the Queen of the Scots, was a devout Catholic. So James had sympathies both ways. Not only that, but within England at the time, there was a powerful reform movement called the Puritans, who were also eager to get King James I of England to get his ear. Along the journey, a petition for religious grievances was given to the king, said to be signed by 1,000 Puritan ministers. Prudently, James gave no answer until he had time to call a conference and consider that petition. But in January of 1604, and I hope Josh and I can get you close to this, but in January of 1604, a conference was held for all religious parties at Hampton Court Palace on the Thames. It is said that the Puritans received very little satisfaction from the king because he was clearly on the side of the Protestant Church of England. However, one Protestant Puritan minister, a man named John Reynolds, described in his learning as, quote, a prodigy and ready, a living library, and a walking museum. John Reynolds. He got the king's ear, and he requested of the king something that stuck to King James. Please give us a Bible. One only translation of the Bible in English to be declared authentic, to be read in the church. Because you see, in that day and time, there were numerous translations of the Bible. They wanted one that did not have marginal notes where the ministers and the priests said, this is what the verse means. Even 400 years ago, these Puritans and Protestants recognized that having somebody else tell you what the scriptures mean is like drinking downstream from the cows. Okay? Go straight to the source if you want to know what the scriptures mean. So they were asking for a new translation of the Bible. Well, as I mentioned to you last week, James caught that idea. And he thought, that's a great idea. And you know exactly why he caught that idea. By the inspiration of the Almighty, James ordered that this new Bible would be created by the two best and brightest universities in the empire, or at least in England, Cambridge and Oxford at that time. 80 years of English translations, most of which were illegal, would be brought together to create one translation that would be the best of them all. By June 30th, 1604, 47 translators, scholars, had been appointed. They were to be divided into 6 companies and assigned different portions of the Bible in English to translate it, the Old and the New Testament and the Apocrypha. And they would try to go as far back to the original Hebrew Old Testament and Greek New Testament as they could. King James appointed Richard Bancroft, and Bancroft, to supervise the project, drew up 15 strict rules that these translators were to abide by. You would appreciate what those rules were. The translators were to compare the existing English translations of the Bible, of which there were several, with the ancient Hebrew and Greek and keep it as close as they could. They were to be selecting that language, quote, as consonant to the original Greek and Hebrew, meaning make it agree. Don't change the meaning. Moreover, when any translator finished his assigned portion within the 6 companies, he would submit his translation to the other members of the company, who would then review it and find out if they all agreed. Humility and faithfulness were the standard for the translators. They were told, you are secretaries for the Almighty, not authors. If there was disagreement, there had to be unanimity, or their translation would not be submitted. Then after each of the 6 companies finished their work, they would send it to the other 5 for review. Their finished work, when it was all done, that finished work was then given into a general committee of review to be reviewed in total one more time. They began in the fall of 1604, and the 47 translators, it took them 3 years before they even got to the committee of review. King James watched the whole process. He grew up as a poet and a man of words and a lover of the scriptures. He was obsessed with books, and he wanted a Bible for all of his people, no matter who they were, an open Bible, no marginal notes to restrict people's understanding. He wanted a Bible authorized to be read in church, quote, so majestic in its language and so filled with dignity that the moment his people read it, they would recognize it as the Master's voice when they heard it. It took 3 more years before the General Committee was finished with their work of review and revision. By 1610, the King James Authorized Bible was ready to be printed. Nothing was left to chance. That Bible had to be as perfect and as precise as it possibly could be. In 1611, it was printed by Robert Barker, the king's printer. One of the history's ironies, though, with the King James Bible is that about 80 to 85% of the language of the King James Bible was directly taken from William Tyndale, who had been executed on the authority of the King of England for translating the Bible into English. Now, there's an irony for you. They didn't like him, but they couldn't argue with his work. And another irony is that the king authorized big Bibles to be set on the pulpit to be read in church, but the demand soon outstripped that, and so they began printing little books that the common man could have. And another irony is, who was it that grabbed onto that Bible and ran with it to America? The Puritans, the very people that King James didn't like, and they didn't like him. And it was one of those little Bibles, one of those little common man Bibles that found its way into a lad by the name of Joseph Smith Jr., who read these words, Tyndale's words. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth to all men indifferently, is how Tyndale translated it. The King James translators put liberally, but it means the same thing, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. In other words, I'm talking to you. You are standing today on holy ground, the origins of the King James Bible. And I tell you that story not just because you were there today, and that ground is rendered holy, but also because the Bible gets a bad rap. You know, we sometimes say, well, the Bible is correct as far as, or is true as far as it was translated correctly. But you understand, the same thing can be said about the Book of Mormon. It's not a perfect book. And because people think that or hear that, they think, oh, the Bible is flawed. Well, that's balderdash. It's a good book. I recommend it. Okay? All right, that's enough of that. All right. To liven this up just a bit, I want to tell you about one of my favorite pioneers. And those of you that have traveled with me before have heard me tell about this story. Mary Bathgate was born right here in Scotland. She was born and raised here, and she worked for 40 years in the coal mines of Scotland. She was just a wee little firecracker of a thing, kind of like Davina today. And somewhere along the way, she and her children worked in the coal mines for pennies a day, and they joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints about 1851. Then when she was way old, she was about 60. Hang on, I'm not being sarcastic. You'll see why that's the case. She and her family immigrated to the United States. Now, she was considered too old to be on the journey and definitely too old to be pulling a handcart. So they assigned her to be the leader of the footmen, meaning that she would lead the old people, which is Josh and I's job. She would lead the old people. That was, no offense meant. She would lead the old people every day outside of the camp, and down the trail they would go. And she had this most delightful little quirk. Every day she'd walk out of camp before the handcarts. She'd swing her cane over her head and she would cry, "Hooray for handcarts." And off she'd go. And then the handcart company would catch up to her. They'd sit down at noon. They would eat a meal. And just before the handcarts would take off, there would go Mary down the trail. Hurry for handcarts. And off she'd go again. Every day. Then one day, August 16th, 1856, somewhere in the sandhills of Nebraska, she sat down on a rock to rest, and a large rattlesnake struck her on the back of the leg right above the ankle. She quickly tied a tourniquet on it, sent a girl that was walking with her to get Captain MacArthur, and, quote, before half an hour, her leg had swollen to 4 times its thickness. I'm quoting out of the company journal. Captain Dan MacArthur related, quote, when we got to her, when we got to her, she was quite sick, but said that there was power in the priesthood, and she knew it. So we took a pocket knife and we cut the wound larger, squeezed out all the bad blood we could, and there was considerable. We then took and anointed her leg and head, laid our hands on her in the name of Jesus, and felt to rebuke the influence of the poison, and she felt full of faith. We then told her that she must get into the wagon. So she called witnesses to prove that she did not get into the sick wagon until she was compelled to by the cursed snake. End of quote. You get the picture? Davina reminds me of this lady, this sassy little spitfire of a Scot. Well, now Mary had not ridden 1 mile in that wagon since leaving Iowa City. Again, she's an old woman, all right? But that day, she was grateful she did because she got really sick. I mean sick after that snake bite. And she remained sick all the rest of that day. She rode all afternoon. But the next day, Captain MacArthur said, the next day when they set out, she was, quote, on the tramp, he said, and cheering her company. She came out of camp that morning, swung her cane over her head, and cried, hooray for handcarts. And off she went all the rest of the way into Salt Lake City. I have loved that story ever since I read it. Because you know what? I told you guys at the beginning, and I'll tell you now, there is no room in this world for sour-faced pickle suckers with rotten attitudes. Okay? And she's an example. You can either get down and woe is me because of the snake, or you can just get up and go. And she got up and went. Now, that's part 1. Here's part 2, which none of you've heard, there or here. James B. Shelley joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints here in Scotland and set out for Zion with his family on the ship Ellen Maria. This is in 1851. They arrived safely in New Orleans and then went up the Mississippi River to Florence, Nebraska, where they were going to get on the trail and come across to the Salt Lake Valley. However, coming up the Mississippi near Memphis, Tennessee, James's wife, Elizabeth, was doing laundry. She dipped a bucket over the side of the boat. The current caught the bucket and pulled her into the river and drowned her. The family came on to Salt Lake without their mother and wife. They arrived October 5th, 1851, and settled near American Fork, Utah. Now, James's granddaughter shares the following story. She said, "Grandfather seemed to miss his beloved wife, Elizabeth. Although Sarah, his young daughter, tried her best to fill the place, though only in her 12th year. This she did for a few years. She married at an early age. His sons also married, and grandfather was left alone." End of quote. Well, not long after the daughter left and James is all by himself, he confided in a friend, "I need a housekeeper." You know, old men, bachelors, lousy housekeepers, whatever. "I need a housekeeper. And would he please keep an eye out for the immigrants coming in and look out for a housekeeper?" Well, the friend took him serious, and not too long after that, he saw a handcart company coming into the valley, and he saw some women in that handcart company that he thought would be suitable, that would need a place to live and employment. So he asked one of them, would they come to American Fork and be the housekeeper for James B. Shelley? The lady agreed. All went well until one day, James happened to meet his bishop, Bishop Leonard Harrington, on the street, and according to the granddaughter, the following took place. Hang on. If you think BYU marriage habits are strange. The bishop approached him and in a cheerful tone said, "Well, Brother Shelley, how's the world treating you? How you getting along anyway?" To which grandfather answered, "Tolerable well, Bishop, but I have a little matter I wanted to speak to you about. For some time, in regard to the housekeeper I engaged some time ago, I wondered if it would be the proper thing to make her my wife. If I don't do so, I've been thinking she might take it in her mind to pick up and leave me. She's going to quit." The bishop responded, "It's just the thing to do." I love this. The bishop said, "A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush." "You go home," he said. "You go home and talk it over with her, and when ready, I'll be pleased to come up and marry you." "Oh, I think it'll be all right with her any time," said grandfather. "I think tonight will be as good a time as any. I'd like to get it over with." But the bishop said, "You haven't asked her yet. You go home and talk it over with, and if there are any objections, let me know. If I don't hear from you, I'll know that everything is all right, and after supper, I'll be there." I love this. Well, she continues by saying, grandfather went home, and he found supper waiting, but anxious to speak to her, he said, before the bishop got there, he said with a peculiar smile, "I see supper is ready, but put on your Sunday dress before we eat. Then hurry supper things away." End of quote. "Why the hurry?" said the housekeeper in her Scottish brogue. "And why should I put on my Sunday dress?" she said. "The bishop's coming to see us," he said. "Well," said she, "the bishop has often seen me in my everyday dress. But," said grandfather with a smile, "he's a-coming up to marry us." To which she said, "To marry us? How do ye ken I hae ya?" "What? What makes you think I'll marry you?" To which grandfather said, "Oh, I think you'll have me all right. I need a housekeeper and you need a home. You might pick up and leave me someday if we're not married. The bishop says a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. He thinks we ought to be married, and so do I. End of quote. To which she said, well, I don't can but what you're right. What time will he be here? Well, grandfather said he may be here any minute now. To which she said, well, nay, eat supper the new. What? We're not going to eat supper now then. We'll enjoy it better after anyway, she said. And very soon, the knock came at the door. The knock came at the door, and the bishop was admitted. After he had carefully shaken hands with the two, he turned to the housekeeper and he said, well, I guess Brother Shelley has told you I've come up tonight to marry you two. That is, if you're both willing and ready. Both assured him that they were ready, and he at once performed the marriage ceremony December 21st, 1856, and thus Mary Bathgate became Mary Bathgate Shelley. And that was one Scottish widow's approach to life. Hooray for handcarts? Just get her done. Okay. All right, now you guys were just there, but this story I think you might appreciate. Born March 21st, 1821, in Holywood, not Hollywood, Holywood, County Down, Ireland. When you were in Belfast at the Titanic Museum, just across the way to the east was County Down. We were right there on the edge of Belfast. He grew up there. In 1840, John Steele married Catherine Campbell, and shortly after, with better chances for work, John came to Glasgow. And there, with his wife Catherine, they set up shop and went to work. Once in Glasgow, John relates, I heard of the Book of Mormon by seeing a handbill posted up purporting to be an ancient writing by an ancient people who lived in America, and that an angel of God had appeared, by whose administration the records of ancient America had been discovered. John said, I borrowed the Book of Mormon from one Graham Douglas and would repair to the banks of the Clyde on Glasgow Green and read it through in 2 weeks. I read Parley P. Pratt's Voice of Warning, attended all their meetings, and in 4 weeks from the first sermon I heard, I was baptized. Then John and Catherine Steele, in 1845, emigrated to Nauvoo, where he worked in the boot and shoe shop. Remember that? Reiser Boot and Shoe? Probably there. John was among those that stood in defense of Nauvoo from the mobs in 1846 in the Battle of Nauvoo. He was one of those, right at the very end, privileged to receive his endowments in the Nauvoo temple before the saints left the city. He was there in February of 1846. Remember that story of the Nauvoo temple catching fire? I never knew how that fire started until I read John Steele's diary. Here's the story. He said, quote, the sisters thought that the floors did not dry fast enough to suit them, and wood was applied freely to the stoves. One of those stoves became red hot, ignited the shingles, and all was soon in a blaze. In other words, upstairs, the women were doing laundry for the temple clothes. The floor was getting wet. It wasn't drying out fast enough, so they super stoked the stove, overheated it, and caught the roof on fire. That's how the Nauvoo temple almost burned down. But John says, we soon extinguished it by all hands in town turning out. There was a continuous line of wagons from the river to the temple, and the people worked with a will. Well, after that, John Steele and Catherine started west with the rest of the saints towards winter quarters. He was at Mount Pisgah in Iowa when Captain James Allen of the United States Army came asking for volunteers to form a Mormon battalion and join the United States in war with Mexico. And don't be offended by what I'm going to quote. John said, quote, you can better imagine my feelings than I can describe them. I must ask pardon for thinking or saying that the United States may all go to hell together. I will see them, meaning the whole United States, in hell before I will fire one shot against a foreigner for those who mobbed, robbed, plundered, and destroyed us all the day long. And now, he said, seek to enslave us to fight for them? I could not find words hard enough to say in just anger for that kind of treatment. Does that give you some idea how hard it was for the men of the Mormon battalion to sign up? More than one of these men in the journals has said, you can go to hell and I still won't join your army. That's how strong the feelings were. And I'm quoting, not being profane. But then John goes on to describe, this is so powerful. John goes on to describe that President Brigham Young came amongst the men and said, brethren, this is from God. Join the army, and this will be the salvation of this church, and not one of you will die. Notwithstanding John's anger and resentment for the murder of the prophet Joseph Smith under government authority, he and all the rest of the men in the battalion signed up and marched off towards California. When they reached Santa Fe, Philip St. John Cook, I'll get it right. Colonel Philip St. George Cook, the United States officer and commanding officer of the battalion, ordered the women at Santa Fe, the women that were in the battalion, to leave. John's wife, Catherine, was in the battalion. She was a laundress. He ordered the women to leave. John went to the colonel and said, if you're sending my wife away, I'd like to go with her. And the colonel threw a fit. But nevertheless, he was given permission, and John Steele led the rest of the women, along with others, to win her over in Pueblo, what is today Pueblo, Colorado. In the spring of 1847, Elder Amos Lyman of the Quorum of the 12 came and got the battalion boys out of Pueblo to bring them into the Salt Lake Valley. And they arrived in the valley just days after President Young. He came in July what?
27.
July. You forgot the holiday? He came in on July 24th, 1847. Yeah, I had to think a second. The battalion boys came into the valley 3 days after, July 30th. And President John describes that moment when the battalion boys came into the Salt Lake Valley, right behind him. He said, President Young and the 12 came out and met our command on the bench and gave us a hearty welcome and receiving, he said, now this is John, and receiving a hearty welcome and a God bless you from the prophet, from the Lord's ministers, worth all we suffered. Does this man love the prophet? August 9th, 1847, John Steele's wife, Catherine, gave birth to a healthy little baby girl, becoming the first white child born in the Salt Lake Valley. They named her Young Elizabeth Steele, after President Brigham Young. And then President Young said, does anybody here know how to make adobe? And John raised his hand and said, I do. And so it was John Steele who taught the brethren how to make adobes in Utah Territory, he and the other boys. And then after they'd all gotten settled in Salt Lake, the call came for John to pick up his family and move to Parowan. Parowan? And then, if that wasn't bad enough, he was then called to go to the Muddy, down around Las Vegas. And finally, after so many years and colonizing and settling again and again, John comes back to Salt Lake City. He said, quote, I then went to Salt Lake City and visited President Young, who told me, quote, I was at liberty to choose any settlement in the territory and make my home, end of quote. According to family records, John Steele asked for land right there in the Salt Lake Valley. I want to stay here. To which he was then told, all that land has been parceled out. I can't give you land here, John. It's all gone. And then, facing the hills directly behind the Capitol building in Salt Lake City. Can you see that real estate in your mind right now? The land directly behind the Capitol building. President Young swept his hand across that horizon and said, but you can have all of that. To which John reportedly said, if that's the best you can do, I'm moving to Tokerville. Now, if you're not from Salt Lake and you don't know Tokerville, you don't get the joke. But if you can picture the real estate, John went down to southern Utah to Tokerville and lived out the rest of his days in faith and obedience, serving as a patriarch, a temple worker, a holistic health doctor, etc., down to the very end, a temple worker and obedient to the prophet. I wonder in the days that followed if John ever came to regret President Young's offer. I don't know. All right. Hang on just a second. Okay, I have to ask. It's late in the day. Again, you're looking like the horse that's been rode hard and put away. Not you, them. Like the horse that's been rode hard and put away wet. You doing okay? All right, there's a couple more stories and then I'll quit. Okay. Margaret Kirkwood was born August 9th, 1809 in Kilbarchan, Scotland. She joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints April 1st, 1840. By the time Margaret departed Scotland for America, she had already buried her husband and 2 of her 6 children, both daughters. Margaret and her boys arrived in Iowa City, June 26th, 1856, and were organized into the Willie Handcart Company. Margaret sold most of her precious belongings to obtain money for her handcart and supplies. As Margaret joined up and came across with the Willie Handcart Company, she did so with 4 sons. Margaret Kirkwood, 4 sons. Robert, 22. Thomas, 19. James, 11. And Joseph, 4. Those of you that know this story only know 2 of those sons and only part of that story. Some years before, her second son, Thomas, had been injured on the streets of Glasgow and was unable to walk. So as they crossed the plains, Thomas was pulled in a handcart all the way across Wyoming by his mother, a frail, petite woman of only 5 feet in height. And with the help of his older brother, Robert. So Robert and Margaret pulled Thomas all the way across the plains. Remember now, Thomas was 19. He was a grown man. When winter snows caught the Kirkwood family in Wyoming along the Sweetwater, it turned an already heavy burden into one unbearable. And then came the ordeal of Rocky Ridge. October 23rd, 1856, the Willie Company was forced, for their own survival, to march 17 miles up and over that awful and exposed summit called Rocky Ridge in the face of a terrible winter storm. With Thomas in the cart, Margaret and Robert struggled all day long and into the next to reach the camp at Rock Creek Hollow. But what about the boys? James, 11, and Joseph, 4, fell behind. When 4-year-old Joseph could no longer walk, when he could no longer keep up, James picked him up and carried him on his back the remainder of that 15 miles through a blizzard. They would not reach camp until the following morning. It is reported that upon reaching camp, James Kirkwood set his little brother down by the fireside. Then James, having so faithfully carried out the task given him by his mother, collapsed and died from exposure and overexertion. What is remarkable is that devotion of 2 older brothers who would labor so long and so hard to carry and save their younger brothers. One older brother would not live, Thomas, but only for 2 more years, while the other would not, James. But they live on in cherished pioneer remembrance. I can't help but think every time I talk about this story, I can't help but think, where did these 2 boys learn such sacrifice for their siblings from a dedicated mother who in some way taught her children that it was important to take care of each other down to the last extreme. And one more thing that is not generally known about the Kirkwood family beyond this sacrifice. When the Kirkwood family became members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Margaret was disowned by her prominent family in Scotland. They were fabric designers, and also she was disowned by her husband's family, the Kirkwoods. Mrs. Kirkwood, Sister Kirkwood, made the statement many times, quote, that if it were necessary, she would go through all the hardships and heartaches again for the gospel's sake. Do we have that kind of grit? Last story for tonight. I've never told this one in a fireside. I've talked about it a lot in television shows, but never in a setting like this. In 1813, the Joseph Smith Sr. family was living in West Lebanon, New Hampshire. It was at this time that a terrible epidemic of typhoid, a waterborne disease, bacterial disease, swept through the Connecticut River Valley and is reported to have killed 6,000 people through the fall of 1812 and into the spring of 1813. It struck the Smith family hard, you all know this story, and took down each of the Smith children one by one. One of the worst that was hit by that was Sophronia, Joseph's older sister. She almost died. It was only by the miracle of faith and the grace of Almighty God that Sophronia survived. But her story is often upstaged by what happened to young Joseph. Joseph was only 7 years old at the time. Joseph got the typhoid, and usually the typhoid would run a cycle of about 30 to 60 days before you were fully recovered. When the typhoid hit Joseph, it formed a large abscess right here in the hollow of his shoulder, between the breastbone and the shoulder. And it filled up, swelled up, became inflamed. They called a doctor who lanced it, and according to Lucy, drained off a full quart of purulent matter. That's disgusting. Mm-hmm. But she also described in her biography that as soon as that was lanced, Lucy would say the pain shot like lightning down Joseph's side and lodged in his leg. And the leg immediately began to swell. And Joseph cried out to his father, "The pain is so severe. How can I bear it? The disease was osteomyelitis, or dead bone infection. After 3 weeks, they called the doctor back, and a Dr. Stone came and lanced the leg open down the shin bone for 8 inches, an 8-inch gash right down the shin bone, and then drained off all of the swelling and again the pus and relieved the pressure. The procedure helped. The pain was lessened, but as soon as it was over, the wound began to heal, and the swelling and inflammation and the agonizing pain started up once again. This is the time when Hiram, 6 years older, would sit with Joseph and hold that leg and prop it so that he could relieve the pain of his younger brother. President Ballard would often say, perhaps it was there that the bond between these brothers was forged that would carry them all the way to Carthage, when Hiram would say, Joseph, I cannot leave you. They called the doctor back a second time, and this time he slit the leg even further down the shin bone, about 10 inches, all the way down to the shin bone. Can you imagine bearing that without anesthetic? And again, it worked for a time, but then it failed. So then they called a council of doctors. Come on in. You're okay. Come on in. They called a council of doctors, including Dr. Stone. And this council of doctors said, in effect, Mother Smith, the leg has got to come off. We have to amputate. It's the only way to save his life, because if we don't cut off the leg, the infection is going to spread through the system and the boy will die. And Mother Smith said, no. Joseph said, no, there's got to be something else you can try. The records indicate that it might have been around first part of April, 1813, that Dr. Nathan Smith of Dartmouth Medical College, along with his colleague, Dr. Cyrus Perkins, and 11 medical students, it appears, came to the Smith home and said, we have a new procedure, experimental. We'll try it. As they began the procedure, they offered Joseph brandy as an anesthetic. They wanted to get him drunk. He said no. They said, well, then we must tie you. We must bind you. And he said, no. But if my Father will hold me, I can bear it. That says something about the relationship between father and son. And then at the last moment, Joseph sent his mother out of the house saying, Mother, you have carried me and bore me all this time. You cannot watch this now. Please leave. So she went out of the cabin, as did the rest of the family. And then they commenced. They opened up the wound, and I've seen the tools that they used. Dr. Leroy Worthland showed them to me. They used a hand-augured bit and drilled down through the new bone and opened up a window to the dead bone that was beneath the new bone. And once they'd opened up a window, they reached in with forceps and snapped off the bone, broke it off in pieces. And when they broke that with the forceps, Joseph screamed so loud, his mother heard it out in the woods. She came running in. And she said, as she burst through into the room, Joseph was pale and sweating, and there was blood everywhere. And she exclaimed, oh my God, what a sight for a mother to see. And Joseph said, Mother, go back, go back. And he sent her away again. And they continued the procedure, breaking off 9 pieces of bone out of his leg. And over the next few weeks, 14 more pieces of bone would work their way out of the leg. Can you imagine bearing that kind of pain for that kind of time? The operation would prove a success. And Dr. Nathan Smith, the records indicate that he came back again and again and again to check on his young patient. The operation was a success, but what most people don't know, it was a miracle. Because Dr. Nathan Smith, who developed that procedure, was a brilliant mind, ahead of his time by 100 years. That procedure that he pioneered would not be successfully repeated as standard medical practice until after World War I. Moreover, the only man in America who could save his life and his leg, the only man in America who could save his life and his leg, lived 5 miles away and made house calls. Dr. Nathan Smith was an eminent pioneer and a physician. Thanks to him, Joseph Smith was able to kneel in that grove in the spring of 1820. By the way, on his way to becoming an MD, a physician, Dr. Nathan Smith spent 1 year studying medicine just up the street in Edinburgh University. I bear my witness to you. This is the Church of Jesus Christ. There are miracles aplenty. One of the great evidences that those on the inside of this church just don't fully see is that there's not a person in this room that hasn't witnessed the kind of miracles that I've talked about. What you don't realize is that the people of other churches, the people outside this room, would die to see what you've seen, know what you know, feel what you feel. The miracles you have seen bear witness that these are the signs of God and you are God's people. And that is my testimony to you and to you. And I say it in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. Good night and God bless.